Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Today's Past Forward conversation is inspired by our film Billy Graham, which explores the life and career of one of the best known and most influential religious leaders of the 20th century. From modest beginnings on a North Carolina farm, Graham rose to prominence with a fiery preaching style, movie star good looks, and effortless charm. His popularity, fueled by his crusades, his use of media, and his proximity to presidents, soon made him a household name and put American evangelicalism on the map. Today, we'll examine the idea of the separation of church and state and the rise of evangelicalism as a political force and its impact on the baseline politics of this country. This is meant to be an interactive and constructive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, I'd like to introduce our panel for this conversation. Anthea Butler is Associate Professor and Graduate Chair of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A sought-after television commentator, Professor Butler regularly writes opinion pieces covering religion, race, politics, and popular culture. Her most recent book is White Evangelical Racism, published this past March. Kevin Kruse is a professor of history at Princeton University. He is the author of several books, including One Nation Under God: How Corporate America Invented Christian America. His most recent book, Fault Lines: A History of America Since 1974, chronicles the origins of the divided states of America. Our moderator, Michelle Borstein, is a religion reporter at The Washington Post. Since January 2006, she has covered American faith and spirituality. The Religion Newswriters Association named her Religion Reporter of the Year for religion writing in large news organizations in 2011, 2013, and 2017. Thank you again and enjoy the conversation.
Thanks, Cameo. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this conversation. Welcome, Anthea and Kevin. It's great to be here with you. In the documentary film, Billy Graham, we watch Graham become an international celebrity and gain access to several US presidents, including Eisenhower and Nixon. The film focuses on understanding the intersection between Graham and American political life and how he was pivotal in changing our ideas about the relationship between politics and religion. He did that in part by embracing new mass media and entertainment, and he set his sights on changing the political culture of the nation. The first president he approached was Truman in early 1950. Truman is a firm believer in the separation of church and state, but he agrees to a meeting with Graham, regretting it later. Let's watch a clip from the film that shows this moment.
In early 1950, Graham is peppering President Harry Truman with letters and telegrams begging for a visit. Truman ignores them all. Truman was a Baptist, and in keeping with the traditions of his faith at that point in time, was a firm believer in the separation of church and state. He didn't like public displays of religion. He, in fact, writes in his diary that he takes guidance from the book of Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7, which are known for their injunctions against showy displays of faith. Finally, House Majority Leader John McCormack puts in a good word with President Truman, and Truman relents and lets Graham come to visit.
Graham came to the meeting with 3 of his associates.
They went to see the president with their white suits and hand-painted ties, and they looked like hospital orderlies at the racetrack.
Toward the end of the meeting, Graham asked Truman if he could pray with Truman. And through secondhand accounts, Truman evidently said, well, I suppose it couldn't do any harm.
Graham grabs Truman by the shoulder and is calling down a prayer for the president. Truman is uncomfortable the entire time, can't handle it. Things get worse when they leave.
When Billy and his team came out of the president's office, the reporters were all there and talking, what did he say? What did he say? Was it good?
Graham made the grievous mistake of rehearsing, as best he could remember, every word Truman had uttered in the course of that hour conversation.
But then they went out on the White House lawn and thanked God for the privilege of having met with the president. And the next day, that was on the front page of all kinds of newspapers all over the country. Truman reacted very badly to what he took to be a show. He said all Billy Graham is interested in is just getting his name in the paper.
We have a letter from Truman to his secretary in which he said, do not ever let that man into the Oval Office again. He's very green. He's a famous preacher by then, but he's very green when it comes to understanding the ways of the world. But he has a thick skin. When people would say no to him, he'd just come right back at them.
Kevin, tell us, what's the significance of this first meeting with Truman for Graham and for the nation?
Well, for Graham, he immediately learns some pretty important lessons. He realizes he made a huge mistake in posing for those pictures and talking to the press and revealing the secrets. He realizes that he's only going to get access to the Oval Office if he can actually learn to respect it and keep his mouth shut. And he learns that really quickly. He realizes that the press is blown back against him. And then in a larger sense, Graham, not just through the interaction with Truman, but through the rejection that Truman gives him, it actually makes things easier in the short term because he doesn't have to walk the line of appealing to both parties. He kind of goes almost all in for Eisenhower in the 1952 campaign. In the larger sense, though, this sets a new precedent, not just for Graham being in the Oval Office, but for all kinds of religious leaders and religious topics to kind of move through the presidency. So it's a really important moment.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about that from today's perspective, we've gotten used to seeing, a lot of presence of religion in politics, and we kind of take it for granted. And in symbolic things like the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, and the National Prayer Breakfast, and that kind of thing. So what do you think? What do both of you think about sort of this expectation that we have for our presidents to have some kind of faith? Like, has that always been there in some way? Did Graham really change that, or did he just make it public? What was going on in the country that might explain that? Anthea.
Yeah, I think, there's always been an expectation there. I mean, I think about Lincoln and, the Gettysburg Address and things like that, where you've just assumed that presidents had faith. It wasn't a question about whether or not they had it. They just had it, right? But what's Graham doing is very different. And we have to think about where he is. It's post-World War II, the atomic bomb has happened, you have the specter of communism. And so for a lot of people, they're starting to think about what are the end times like? How is it supposed to happen? Are we safe? And this idea about not being safe, plus that we're also entering into another war, the Korean War and this conflict, it means that they really want to have a president that seems to be solid and have faith. And I think what Billy Graham taps into is a sense in which where his presence is in the Oval Office, whether that is the mess up with Truman or his relationship with Eisenhower, it gives a sense of stability. It gives a sense in these kind of really difficult times that people think the end is coming, that their president is somebody who is close to God and secondarily shows that to the public.
Right. And what about, following that, then we move towards the first Catholic president. And you're talking about these concept of the end times and sort of these different religious ideas coming into, public discussion. So how big a deal was it? Where does JFK fit into this?
Huge. I mean, we both could talk about this, but I'll just start. I mean, you have to think about the kinds of anti-Catholicism that's there. I mean, Al Smith runs, and you have all these anti-Catholic cartoons. There's a whole history of anti-Catholicism. And so having JFK run in the midst of this kind of crisis situation makes people think, is he going to be calling on the Pope instead of, looking to our government, looking to the three branches of government? Who is he going to be calling, in order to have help? That's first of all. And secondarily, there's a huge Protestant Catholic bias that's still there. This is pre-Vatican II. You've got people who are not facing the front, not looking at you. I mean, the only Catholic priest that people were probably seeing during this time is Fulton J. Sheen, who's on television, right? And there's a mystique about Catholicism that's really there. And I think that what plays into this is sort of the tensions between Protestants and Catholics, first of all, and then JFK being this big unknown, which is why he has to get out in front of everything and basically do this disclaimer in Houston, Texas, when he addresses the ministerial conference to say, I am going to be, president and not just representing the Catholic Church.
Yeah, all that. I'd also add, I mean, you can think of JFK in two different ways, right? He both is shows how far this movement has gone, but also the nature of who he is. He has to act as a check on this movement too. So by that, I mean, Catholics have long been seen as outside the religious mainstream, outside the social mainstream of America. This is why Al Smith's campaign in 1928, the first Catholic candidate of a major party, crashes and burns. So the Klan says he's going to be beholden to the Pope. But they show pictures of him dedicating the Holland Tunnel, and they say it was a tunnel he built all the way to Rome, right, to the Vatican. Yeah. And so JFK has to fight against that. But by embracing some of this, he shows, and he's part of a larger trend in which Catholics are a real force in this. Fulton Sheen was a big part of this on TV. The Knights of Columbus, Catholic politicians like Joe McCarthy are all in favor of this. And so it becomes a broadly ecumenical movement, right? And that's a lot of what Eisenhower and others like Graham embraced this, because they wanted religion to be something that could tie Americans together, right? Rather than thinking about the ethnic lines that had divided them. We all, they say, have in common one of the three great faiths of democracy: Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism. We're all together, right? So JFK being elected shows in some ways that is actually true. But because of the panic that Anthea talked about him being a Catholic and might be beholden to Rome, JFK in office actually had to downplay his religious faith, because he had to go out of his way to show he wasn't going to take orders from the Catholic Church. And so he actually amplifies and augments a lot of the old church-state separation. When the school prayer decision comes down in 1962, he actually cautions Americans, we don't need much religion in the public square, right? So he both extends this into kind of Catholics being part of this inner circle, but also then retreats a little bit. So it's a complicated story.
Yeah, the time sounds complicated, because you kind of got this different images coming forward: fundamentalist, evangelical, Catholic, and communism, and et cetera. So that's a good time to go to our next clip. When Eisenhower wins the 1952 election, he believes his faith is one of the reasons that he won, and he works to deploy religious values as a way to push back against the perceived communist threat. So let's watch that.
America speaks at the polling booths from coast to coast as 55 million from all walks of life cast their votes for the 33rd man to become president of the United States.
Eisenhower wins a resounding victory in 1952. He calls Graham to his hotel in New York City after the election and has a meeting with him. And he says, I think one of the reasons I was elected was that we need spiritual renewal in this country.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution.
Eisenhower firmly believed that religion needed to be worn on one's sleeve.
So help me God.
That faith had to be manifested in public in order to inspire people in private.
My friends, would you permit me the privilege of uttering a little private prayer of my own? And I ask you.
Eisenhower believed that national success depends on shared sacrifice, and that the Cold War at some level was a spiritual battle, and that in order to summon people into alliance depended on having a larger spiritual purpose that was explicit.
Communism is a religion, At this moment, it appears that communism has all the earmarks of Antichrist. It is masterminded by Satan himself. Who is greater, Marx or Christ?
What Billy Graham could provide to Eisenhower is a way to deploy certain kinds of ideas about nationalism and Christianity and pushing back against the communist threat.
The communist philosophy is infiltrated into every country of the world, including America.
Billy Graham thinks that America is a special nation. He believes that it is a nation that is supposed to lead the rest of the world in terms of democracy, in terms of Christianity.
I want to tell you it's more patriotic to be a Christian, to live for God, than it is to carry a gun in time of war.
America is the greatest force that God has ever allowed to exist on his footstool.
I believe that America is the great spiritual arsenal of the world.
Eisenhower was pleased by thinking of Graham as the sort of religious leader of the country.
Together, they help effect a new set of ceremonies and symbols that conflate piety and patriotism to a degree never seen before.
So Graham capitalized on the anti-communist fervor at the time to galvanize his followers. Can you speak a little bit to how he did this, the ways he did this, how calculated it was or not, and how much him and Eisenhower aligned ideologically? Maybe go first, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, he as Anthea noted, he takes advantage of the crisis of the Cold War, specifically when the Soviet Union gets the bomb. I mean, his debut revival in Los Angeles happens 2 days after the announcement that the Soviet Union has nuclear power now, and the country's in a moment of panic, and it drives a lot of people to Graham. It drives a lot of people to their knees in prayer, wondering about what's going to happen next. And he does a good job of using that, because Graham's message, even long after this early Cold War period, is you may die today. You may die tomorrow. You don't know when reckoning is going to come. And the atomic panic of the Cold War really drives that message home. So he leans into that and takes advantage of it. He's very much in tune with Eisenhower. He's literally providing lines for his speeches. He's echoing Republican catchphrases on the campaign trail, keeps insisting he's not going to be partisan, but drops some considerable hints along the way. He says, Harry's not doing a good job, but he just can't do any better. Or he says, I don't want to talk politics, but I'll just say that, after my car's been running for a long time, I find the need to change the oil. That's all I'm going to say, right? So it's not very subtle what he's doing. But he, like Eisenhower, believes that a broad religiosity is going to be good for the nation. But the nation needs this to survive. And it's not just the religious ends. They also align on a lot of the politics too, right? I mean, they have the same kind of anti-communist, pro-capitalist agenda.
Yeah. Anthea, what about, if you want to comment on that, or if you want to talk more broadly also about sort of, this conflation of piety and patriotism that they talk about in the clip, and like what this means, what this kind of opens up for the future politics of the country.
Yeah, and I want to take it from the stance of communism, because I think what the person who would have watched this said, oh, he's talking about communism, but you have to understand communism the way that Billy Graham understood it, which was as a godless religion. It was seen as a religion that would replace Christianity. And so the fervor that he has about this is not just about, I'm scared of the bombs and everything. I'm scared that this is going to supplant Christianity. Then I'm out of a job, right? So, other words, you've got to really preach his heart. But it's not just that. It's also the ways in which communism is talked about from outside of Billy Graham. So this is the time period where we're starting to get into the Red Scare. People who are doing civil rights are being labeled as communists. This is a big epithet about anybody who wants change in America. So you have to see it out of this perspective, and what draws out from that are the ways in which Graham says his speeches, and when he's preaching, he's lining up communism and saying, you need to get saved, right? I'm going to use that term, because if you don't come to Christ, the nation is going to fall. And that bringing all of that together is our beginnings of sort of like the Christian nationalism is already there, but it's a way to bring in your particular individual faith if you don't cleave on to Christ, then the nation is going to fall and we're going to be communists. And so this is a really powerful mix of things that dovetail exactly with what Eisenhower wants. But it's also a message that people are hearing that if they don't turn their lives around, then the nation is going to fall. And this is a kind of trope that you hear over and over and over again, even today, from evangelicals and others, about your personal morality and the way you behave has a part to do with what the nation will prosper or not.
So let's back up just a little bit for context. So, basically what we're talking about is the, rising of this evangelical Christian political power figure and sort of how that comes into today. But where did that come from? Like, how is that, the movie talks about Billy Graham, fundamentalism in the country at the time and in his past, like, how is that different from the fundamentalist movement? And how did evangelicals kind of come out of that and seek political change and power?
Okay, so this is the short version, all right? So you have, I gotta make this really quick. You have the fundamentalists who want to get back to the Bible. This is late 19th century, early 20th. You have the fundamentals, which are published by, Oil Magnet, 1915, that gets you into thinking about scripture and studying scripture because historical biblical criticism is pushing back against this. Now, everybody likes to put scopes in this story, but I think the more important story here to think about is the breakup between fundamentalism and this new evangelicalism actually happens with institutions where Bob Jones in Westminster breaks off from Princeton and all of this other stuff. And then you have the the National Association of Evangelicals that gets formed in the 1940s. You see Billy Graham with Youth for Christ. This is the new neo-evangelicalism, okay? And that neo-evangelicalism plays out in various ways, plays out in institutions like Fuller Seminary that gets started in the 40s with Charles Fuller, who's a radio evangelist. And then we see Billy Graham coming onto the scene and using media and all of this. And one of the things that did not come out in the film, but I think is really important, the magazine Christianity Today, one of the founders is Billy Graham. That's 1956. So all the things you see in this movie that are about media and print and how you see him on Time magazine and everything, that's about how fundamentalists who want to not engage with the public and the culture, who want to keep themselves pure, versus these new evangelicals who are engaging the culture, being out in it, doing films, preaching out in public, going to Madison Square Garden, and starting a magazine like Christianity Today to engage the culture in different ways.
Yeah.
Right.
And that political culture is part of that, right? And so what's important is that the evangelicals, when they start, we take them for granted today. The religious right, there's a huge presence. The polling, we constantly are asking, what are white evangelicals going to do? They are a new political force in this era, right? And so the founding of the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, in 1942, by the time Eisenhower comes around and Graham is on the scene, they're still a pretty new group. In fact, the NAE writes Eisenhower for a meeting in 1953, and his staff initially wants to reject it. They have no idea who these people are. And then finally they do some research with the Library of Congress, and they say, oh, they represent about 10 million conservative Christians, and they seem pretty influential. We should have a meeting. So they use that political power, like Graham, to get entry into the White House. And actually, their meeting is kind of remarkable. We don't talk about this a lot, but they present Eisenhower with a document stating that the government of the United States is founded on what they call the 7 divine freedoms, a play on FDR's 4 freedoms from World War II. And these are all drawn from the 23rd Psalm. And they get Eisenhower and Nixon and many of the cabinet and Supreme Court justices to sign this document, stating in effect that America is a Christian nation.
Right. So did the fundamentalists at the time was there a lot of debate about it? Like where, this is not the way to change society. We should focus on prayer versus engaging with this sort of secular, godless political sphere.
Guess what? Fundamentalists hate Billy Graham. Okay, they hate him. Like, Billy Ray Hargis, all these people, Bob Jones, they detest Billy Graham and they can't stop talking about him. It might be a little bit of jealousy, but they basically see him as, straying away from the faith because all of this engagement with culture, they don't like it. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. And I think it's really important to understand that even though Billy Graham in his belief system really still thinks like a fundamentalist, he's operating very differently than fundamentalists are at this time.
Yeah.
Right. And we're not going to go all the way to the present right now, but I just wanted to pause at that for a second to think about like, how did that how does that relevant today? Where are they still having that question? Like, how do we engage with the culture? Like, are we better off or worse off by doing that? That's kind of what the Southern Baptists are fighting about right now. And also, how does that affect this conversation about the connection between piety and patriotism that they were having? Are we still having that same conversation or a different version of it?
I don't think we're having the same conversation. I think the way that it's deployed is very different. I'd be interested to hear what Kevin says. But I think, when I think about people like Robert Jeffers and others who, everybody has flags in their churches, they're doing all this Christian nationalism kind of stuff. If we think about, Jericho marches and things that have been happening in DC, all of these things, the way it's very different now is that it's just assumed that it's going to happen. That's the first thing. It's a very big assumption about that. And it's not even argued about. And I would say secondarily, if we're talking about Southern Baptists and thinking about critical race theory or any of the other things that they're fussing about right now, one of the things I would say about that is that what has changed is that they're not expecting to influence the culture through religion. They're expecting to influence the culture through political means and by getting politicians to come on their side of things. And so where you see all of these people saying they don't like critical race theory and these states like Missouri and others talking about changing the teaching, those things go hand in hand. And this is what people need to understand, is that it's a very different ball game than what the 50s were.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And I think that the point about what's been taken for granted now is really important and feeds us back into this story then, because this is when it's created, right? And what Graham is doing is invoking a certain sensibility about America being a Christian nation, or in a new term at the time, a Judeo-Christian nation, but really putting into place all the institutional and symbolic manifestations of that, right? So things that we take for granted for now, they all happen in about a 5-year period from 1952 to 1957. The congressionally mandated National Day of Prayer, the National Prayer Breakfast, now an annual tradition, Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, In God We Trust, again, is something that might actually unite the country. That's the people behind it believed these things were something that all Americans get behind. They become divisive later on, right? But now this new generation can point back and say, well, our Pledge of Allegiance says under God. Our motto is In God We Trust. Therefore, we should do X, Y, and Z on the agenda of the religious right because of these things, right? And so they are building on what Graham did and taking it in directions he might not have intended, but they don't have to fight against this assumption that religion and politics don't mix because Graham started it all.
Seemed like it's, from their point of view, kind of over. So one of the things that Graham did as he was trying to shape this movement is, reach out to Christians of different denominations and races. Although during the civil rights movement, he made some politically expedient decisions that marginalized Black civil rights leaders. What role did race play in the movement under Graham, and how did that get us to where we are today?
Well, I talk about this in my new book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. And I think, we have to start with Graham and understand he's a Southern guy and he grows up in the South. And that's first of all. And that doesn't mean that he's going to be, necessarily racist. But what that does mean is that he's used to racial mores. And so when he has a revival in Dallas in 1953, he joins W.A. Criswell's church. This is First Baptist that still exists now. It was one of the most, at the time, Criswell was one of the most racist Southern Baptists there was. And, he joined that church willingly. But at the same time, what you start to see in 1954 and forward, he has some meetings that are integrated and some that are not integrated, or that they are separated because, Jim Crow and all that separation stuff, right? So there's this tension for him. And the tension is that how far can I go? So the clip you see of King praying at his revival, that's about him reaching out to everybody in the community and how they talk about what they want to do. But at the same time, he doesn't want to turn away the white benefactors and, political figures. So when King asked him not to see, Governor Daniels, or what, I forget his name, in 1957, he says, thank you, Price. He says no, right? And then we go forward and we start to see him say statements about the civil rights movement. He doesn't like all the marching. He doesn't like the sit-ins. He's wary of this. He thinks that things are going too fast and it should be gradual. And the bulk of his theology, and this is important to realize, I think, when he says that, to paraphrase, that this, kind of togetherness of little Black boys and little white girls will only happen in heaven. His eschatological reason is that this integration is only going to happen in heaven. We should not expect it on earth. And so I think that's a very interesting thing to remember about Graham. And then later on, and I talk about this in my book, I think he incorporates a lot of African Americans and Africans into his, revivals. But at the same time, it's sort of this representational politics of having a Black person as opposed to this synthetic bringing together naturally of Black people being involved in his ministry.
Right. So if I'm hearing you right, you're saying, in a way, he set the stage for that division among evangelicals today.
Well,
but there also was the theology, right? I mean,
it's the theology. And I wouldn't even say it was division. What I would say is it's the gentility of racism and the gentility of the fact that you can say that you're not racist because you have Black people in your congregation, but you don't want to deal with the serious issues of division and inequality that are happening. You have to understand the biggest thing for somebody like Billy Graham or evangelicals is that racism is a sin, but it's an individual sin, not a structural sin. And so that is the difference. So for him, you have to change your heart. You have to come to Christ and not be a racist anymore. You hear this talk right now, but the fact of the matter is it didn't change anything. And that's how all of these racial reconciliation things happen, that Billy Graham would have loved, right? But they're performances. They're not structural change.
Right. Civil rights activists are seeking for the federal government to get involved and end segregation in the South and discrimination nationwide. And the argument that you just got to believe you can't change hearts with law is when the segregation is constantly used. And Billy Graham, wittingly or unwittingly, feeds right into that.
It'd be interesting to know what he would think about the CRT conversations. I mean, do you think he'd be right there with that? Or, does that sound like his theology?
I think he'd be with it. I mean, I think he would have hated all the division about it. But I think that, I don't see it, to be honest with you. I mean, he joined the Southern Baptist Church. What can I say? He grew up a Presbyterian, he joined the Southern Baptist Church. So obviously the apple don't fall far from the tree.
So speaking of, just evangelical movement in general as a movement, I mean, how unified is the evangelical political agenda? And how has that impacted the baseline politics of our country? That's a very sweeping question.
Yeah, it is. Well, I'll take a first sweep at it. I mean, the political agenda is actually pretty unified, I'd say, and you all may disagree. And you can see this by the fact that all Donald Trump had to do was to wheel out a list of judges that he promised to appoint to a meeting of about 1,000 leaders of the religious right at Trump Tower in the summer of 2016, and they all fell in line. And with that, the nomination and the election were basically his. And that judges are the thing that motivate the leadership and the kind of the political armies of the religious right. What we're seeing increasingly, though, is that there's a fracturing in the evangelical community, especially as I think younger generations have really kind of seen the leaders of the religious right, that's kind of second generation, not Jerry Falwell, but Jerry Falwell Jr., have gone all in on the politics side of this and have really neglected the faith part. And have really strayed away from that. And that is ultimately more important for this younger generation who sees the Christianity as the first thing they should be engaged with and conservatism as secondary to that. And they feel the leadership's got it a little bit reversed.
And they're also debating, the feeling that this has become more political than, spiritual and religious. But there's also disagreements about agendas, like when we talk about CRT or critical race theory. That's getting back to what are the causes of the social problems that we have. So it's hard to see if it's both, like how fractured, people are always saying this election, the evangelical vote's the white evangelical vote is going to be, is going to be more divided. And then every year it's not at all. So it's hard to see. I wonder if the, sort of racial justice protests and the critical race theory discussions will push that fracturing, or if people just remained unified on that.
I really think, honestly, Michelle, I think part of what's going to happen is that you're going to see even a harder hardening. And if the lines could get drawn more evenly, I think the people who are leaving and they're going somewhere else. That's just the way it is. I mean, the Pew Forum studies are showing us this. But that hardcore 21% of evangelicals that are there who vote very strongly Republican, they are going to stay in that spot. They are not leaving. And I think that, you've been long enough around long enough to hear the conversations about, is the religious right dead? Is the religious right dead? I'm like, it's never dead. And the reason why it's never dead is because it has lobbying organizations that make sure that everything keeps going. And I think that's the part that people don't see, is that we tend to focus on people as voters, but we don't see this giant apparatus of things like American Family Association or Focus on the Family that are driving a lot of these issues in terms of denominations too, like the Southern Baptists.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more when we look at sort of the evangelical movement today without Billy Graham. So you've got, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, we have this question of, another generation really turning off from the heavy, partisan politics and religion, and also debating things more, whether it's immigration or racial justice and causes of racial inequities and that kind of thing. Is it fair to say that that things are, that the generational differences are that are significant? I mean, Anthea is saying there's going to be a hardening of the people who are, the most hardcore. But I mean, is this a period, basically? Was he sort of the beginning of a period, and it's obviously not going to go on forever till the end of time? I mean, where is it sort of, where's the most dynamic parts of the evangelical movement today? It could be some of it could be what you said, structural. Maybe, there's a whole generation of different institutions or other ways, whether it's cultural, a lot of pop culture figures today and that kind of thing. I'm trying to kind of get back to thinking about where are things going so that we're sort of prepared for whatever the next change is.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I do think that in a lot of ways that, denominations and some of these organizations have to think about what this demographic change looks like, right? And what that's going to mean for holding together the constituencies that they want to have. So that's the first thing. But the other part of it is structural, because the kinds of things that, I think evangelicals who are voting very conservatively want are going to be in place for a long time. Where I'm thinking about judges, whether that's, the 3 Supreme Court judges or the 200 judges that were appointed in the last administration, right? So that's going to be an issue. I think, we're going to tell a big tale when this abortion case comes to the Supreme Court, because I think that's going to be a huge issue to sort of see what happens. So all the things that the structures that they put in place, do they work or do they not work in certain kinds of ways? But I do think the other part, which is the X factor, and I'll be interested to hear Kevin talk about this from a different angle, is the X factor is the pandemic, obviously. The pandemic has changed church going. The pandemic has changed the ways in which people consume religion. They were already looking at TV and podcasts and things like that. But how do you hold together groups of people when you've been so separated for, now going on a year and a half? And now we're all coming back together. Will it ever be the same, or is it going to be something different? And that's the answer I don't know how to answer for you. I just don't know. I'm very curious, though, to see what happens.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And to circle back to your earlier point about the way in which Graham and his generation took advantage of new media, I think we're going to see a new generation of evangelicals take advantage of new forms of social media to get their message out, to form organizations. And I think the COVID trend has only pushed that, right? Yeah. In some ways, I think the future of this question might not be answered by what's going on inside the evangelical movement. Although I agree with you that the hardening is going to happen. It's going to be like what's going on in the Republican Party. They've lost people who have identified as Republicans, and what that means is the ones who are left behind are even more all in on the kind of the agenda of the last administration than the party had been before going in. They've shed those people. The same thing I think is happening in white evangelical circles. But what's going to be interesting is what happens with the country as a whole, right? And what we've seen here is the share of the country that chalked itself up as either spiritual but not religious, or one of the none category, not N-U-N-O-N-E, they belong to no formal faith. That group has steadily grown, right? And we've seen an awareness of their presence in politics that in some ways is kind of like the awareness people had of born-again Christians 50, 60 years ago, right? And that this is a force that's going to be in there. And as that force makes itself known, the way in which, say, the religious right did a couple generations ago, that's going to push back on evangelicals and I think shape where they go and how we think about them.
One of the things that seems most glaring when I think about him is, and I see this, I struggle with this all the time as a religion reporter, is that he really represents when there was a figure, when there were these institutions and there were leaders that were clearly looked to. And it's hard for, for us when we're covering it, because you realize it's all blown up. And so you don't have a Billy Graham or anything like that, where you can say this person definitely can influence, millions of people, et cetera. And that I feel like that's going to be sort of part of the evangelical future, is like how, and that's true with all Americans, is sort of, this challenging of institutions and figures in power and that kind of thing. But it's like, it seems hard to even imagine who will be the sort of, I don't want to say Billy Grahams, but people, if he was just kind of a one-off. And also if evangelicalism kind of brings about the lack of a single leader because of the way it's structured, that, you wind up, looking sometimes to pop culture or whatever, as much as you are to churches. Anyway, so, okay, we're going to go to some questions from people watching. Question 1, are you concerned that the response to these excellent critiques will be to say the church and religion shouldn't be involved in politics at all? What would that mean for Black churches?
Well, here's the way I would answer that question. You can make those critiques all you want. There's another reality, though, and they're involved. And I think, one of the things that's important to say is that the way white churches are talked about being involved in politics vis-a-vis the way Black churches are being involved and talked about it being politics is very different. And you really need to understand from a historical perspective, the reason why the Black church had to be involved is because of advocacy, of being against slavery, of being against Jim Crow, of being against lynching, all of these things. I mean, the Black church was there as a critique to what America was not doing. And so to me, it stands in a very prophetic tradition, which is very different than a tradition of white evangelicalism that has been about individualism and individual's faith and individual salvation.
So you're saying it's not that people are saying don't be involved. They're saying don't be involved in a way that's
exactly.
People see as destructive.
Yeah. And I think that, to think about these binaries, if you think about it from a church state binary, just throw that out, because it's, Thomas Jefferson had lots of hopes and wishes, but that ain't what happened in this country. It's just not the case. And we can talk about this through 400 years of history. It's not possible. It just doesn't happen. Even if we say it doesn't happen in the documents, it's not happening. But I do think that what's important to really realize is that the Black church has a whole different set of things that have come against it. I mean, if you want to just think about, election cycles and everything else, the ways that people are pushing back on Sunday voting and everything else, that's not going to hurt white evangelicals, it's going to hurt Black churchgoers. And I think that's important to say.
What's your sense, Kevin, about sort of this conversation about, church and religion, and not that you want to say, should it be involved in politics, but like, what are some other ways to think about that?
Well, I think it'll always be involved in politics. I think it's a matter of how we think about it, right? And so this idea about how we think about America, the idea of America as being a nation made up largely of Christians is an old one. And that's how the founders understood it. The idea that America should be a Christian nation or should be a religious nation is a different proposition, right? And it's how we think about it. It's not that you're going to totally divorce people's faith from their politics, but if you make it a predicate, if you make it a requirement to be involved in politics, that's something rather different. If you take the dictates of politics from faith, that's rather different. And so we're never going to completely untangle those. It's more about thinking about the way in which we think about people of faith as part of a larger a voting public, of a larger polity that's out there shaping the way in which the country moves.
One of the people watching is asking a little bit about the interaction between communist ideas and Christianity. How did they come to be seen as, opponents? Or how did that come to be seen as the central debate, communism versus Christianity?
I mean, largely through the work of folks like Graham. As Anthea noted, if you look at the way in which people talk about communism in the 50s, the top two adjectives put in front of it are godless and atheistic. I've even seen ones who called it godless, atheistic communism, in case you missed the point, right? But thinking about communism as hostile to religion, but also thinking about it as a rival religion. Again, Graham in, I think, 1957 said, you can't explain the great advances that the Soviet Union has made over the last 10 years, from getting the atomic bomb to Sputnik. You can't explain this unless they've had some supernatural help, unless they're being aided by the devil himself, right? So if you're a Christian and you're hearing someone like Billy Graham say, either the Soviet Union is antithetical to religion in general, or it is in fact led by the devil, or those are your marching orders.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they called it the Great Satan. All right, you can't, how else can you say this except to say, there's also an even earlier history, not so much mixed up with, religion, but if we think about things that happened like the Tulsa race riots or anything like that, or the riots of 1919, communism is used against people who are being activists then too. And so there's already something in the air. I think what happens with Graham post-World War II and his ascension to being a very powerful public figure, religious figure, is that he knows how to put this together in such a way that aligns itself not just with showing communism as being this horrible sort of atheistic religion, but also showing it as the thing that prevents democracy from flowing throughout the world, and America being the country that is going to do that.
Right. Do you think that resonates as much today when people are kind of, that's become such a common, communist socialist attack in just the last few years again? Do you think that it resonates less, or do you think it's as effective? And
no, I don't think it works as well. I think they've blown that dog whistle too many times, and I don't think it's resonating. And also, there's a younger generation that has come up hearing the things that people on the right denounce as communists or socialists and not thinking it's a big deal, right? If you came of age during the Obama years and you heard them calling Obamacare socialist or the stimulus socialist, at some point it stops having an effect, I think.
Yeah. So what about, this is another person writing in, do you think that, essentially the question is asking about what was the relationship between church and state before this Billy Graham era that we're talking about, and is all the conversation we're having today and kind of tough debate about the place of religion in politics going to bring us back to that other period? Like, what's a fair way in 2 seconds to tell the viewers about what the separation of church and state was like before, and where it might go after all this evangelical movement?
I can't do it in 2 seconds, but I'll try to be quick. Before this, there's a slow, steady march of faith into politics, but it's usually kind of larger tropes. FDR's first inaugural address is littered with religious references. His second inaugural address is basically he's likening him to Moses in Exodus. So religion had been in politics before. What's new in this era is it gets formalized, it gets institutionalized. It takes root. We'd had religious revivals before, the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and so on. What happens in this period is it literally gets written into our laws. It gets they etch the words "In God We Trust" behind the Speaker's dais in the House of Representatives, right? So these things are added in, and they have a sense of permanency. And at the time, it's seen as not a big deal. Yale Law School Dean Eugene Rostow calls this, as I talk in my book, ceremonial deism, right? And by that, he meant ceremonial is just purely ornamental, right? It doesn't really matter. But what happens is, as these symbols and ceremonies get cemented and then become repeated year after year, people come to expect it, right? And it just snowballs. Presidents used to not end their addresses with "God bless you" and "God bless the United States of America." But once Ronald Reagan started doing it, every president after has to do it, right? And so once these things happen, they continue to grow and grow and grow, and they build on each other, and they refer back to the last instance to justify the new one. And so it's going to be hard to unwind that. I do think it'll happen at some point as the country becomes less dominated by Christians and religious folks in general. But we're nowhere near that now. It's going to be very hard to kind of unwind this and get back to that earlier state. And a lot of it is for good reasons. The old fights over separation of church and state happened in a large part because Protestants and Catholics were at each other's throats. The organization Americans United for Separation of Church and State, for its first 10 years of its existence in the post-war period, was called Protestants and Other Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, because they were worried about Catholics, right? Well, that fear has gone down, again, largely thanks to JFK and his presidency, and now Joe Biden, the second Catholic president. And so I don't think we're going to go back to that old concern about separate church and state, largely because a lot of the people who used to be worried about it are now pushing for separation, for lack of separation, right? So the Baptists used to be the strongest defenders of separation of church and state, and now you find Baptists are really on the side of the religious right.
Yeah. I'm just going to,
sorry.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to simply say it this way. As long as there's money to be made in religion, this is not going to happen. And so I think, there's a whole kind of conversation to talk about the, gazillions of dollars that go in from, religious organizations to lobbying. And so that's a part of this as well. This is not going to change. Not going to change.
Let's look at a little bit about the end of, just to come back to Graham on one of another viewer's questions. How at the later part of his life, did he wind up regretting some of these associations? What happened to him at the end of his life?
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry, Watergate, if you've seen the documentary, Watergate is basically his own come to Jesus moment in which he realizes he had strayed way too far into partisan politics. And he decides he's not going to be that wedded to partisan issues. He pointedly rejects the moral majority. He disagrees with Reagan on a lot of issues, especially nuclear issues, and really breaks with that movement. And that's the problem. I think a lot of people today, maybe his son in particular, are following the example Graham set in the first quarter century of his political activism and not looking at the way in which he realized he made some serious mistakes and tried to atone for that in the next half century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, how the film shows about how he changes about nuclear engagement and armament and starting to talk about that. I think that is a big piece of this. But there's other pieces that he has to apologize for. He has to apologize for the ways he talks about homosexuals. He has to apologize for that stuff. He doesn't do the same things for the civil rights movement. And then there's the silencing. And then that's the question is, like, when he gets older and we're told that he's saying certain things, how do we know, right? I mean, he basically, gets his last speech in early 2000s and then kind of goes away and is off the public radar. And then we see the rise of Franklin, who, people have asked, a lot of people texted during the show. It's like, well, how come Franklin, and I'm like, well, you have to really listen to Franklin and realize that some of the things that Franklin is saying, it's not that very far away from his father. And so I think it's really important to sort of, you can separate them, but there's a continuum there in terms of their involvement in politics as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, this is another reader question or viewer question, that, in a lot of people's minds, especially maybe younger people, Billy Graham gets kind of put in with other famous evangelicals like the Falwells and even the televangelists, like the Bakers and that kind of thing. Do you think that's fair, or was he really something different?
He is a singular figure. I'm sorry. Falwell is not the same thing as Billy Graham as anything else. But Billy Graham had a moment, and the moment that that his star erupts, if we want to say that, in 49, because of William Randolph Hearst and these confluence of things coming together, it's just not the same. And the ways in which, Jerry Falwell Sr. operates is very different, or Jerry Falwell Jr., or we're talking about Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, or, a big important figure, I think, who gets missed a lot, Pat Robertson, who has influenced, evangelicalism and politics in a very different way, but an equally important way. They are different kinds of figures for different kinds of time periods. Billy Graham has this worldwide sort of thing that happens with him, and the ways in which he goes out to evangelize and does all of this stuff where he's actually doing the legwork, right? These other people get to do the footwork on television. They don't even have to go out as much. And I think that's a very big difference. I think honestly, the person who I consider to be comparable to him, but not the same, is Oral Roberts. And I think that we miss Oral Roberts as a political actor too. And I think that's really important to see him, although he's operating in a very different way. You can see that confluence come together in where we are right now.
Agree completely. Yeah.
So it's hard for us to speculate like what he would think about what's going on today, the last, decade or so. I don't know if we have time for that. We have kind of time for a quick one. What about, are there any key, should we leave viewers with any sense of what are the key fractures that are present among evangelicals today? We talked a little bit about younger people wanting more focus on religion and less focus on political power. Is there anything else that comes to your mind that you think are like key issues?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to talk about two that are the top of mind for me because I think about them a lot and write about them. One is race. Race and racism are crucial, and how that interacts with ideas about nationalism and ideas about what the nation should be. This is the reason why evangelicals have a huge problem at least some anyway, talking about Black Lives Matter or talking about, the things that they have been led to think that are terrible, like, crime and how that affects America, or how they even think Black people or Latinos or anybody or immigrants exist in this world. I think, there's a lot of naivete out there about how they see the world vis-a-vis what the world really is and what our government is really doing. So that's one. I think the second is in the issue of gender and sexuality. I think that, one of the things that probably galvanized a lot of evangelicals was, Obergefell and same-sex marriage. That really made it very big. And I'll let Kevin jump in and say some stuff here.
Those are the big two. But there are other issues where I think a younger generation has realized that their interests are not wholly aligned with the interest of the Republican Party, in the way in which in Jerry Falwell Sr.'s time, it seemed like they were in lockstep. Those are two big issues. Another one, you look at evangelicals talking about creature care, or creation care, and we need to, look out for the environment, or need to be concerned about refugees, who are, reading the gospel on their own and coming to a different set of political conclusions. That's going to be a concern as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kevin and Anthea, for joining us this evening. It was great to be with you.
Great to be with you too.
Yeah, it was nice to see you. Here's Cameo George with some closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely past forward conversation. Billy Graham is available to stream in full on AmericanExperience.org. You can watch any of our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you liked what you saw today, please go ahead and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. Thank you.